continues, especially in the US with the atomic scare of the 40s, and especially the early 50s when the Russians also detonate their own atomic bomb. You see on the left this amazing photograph of shelters being exhibited and sold in Los Angeles. On the right, we see a page of popular mechanics on the building of local shelters. The culture of shelters was very important, very significant one, and present physically, visually in the American cities during all these years. And this is also true in Germany, in Western Germany during the Cold War. So in fact, the culture of shelters ends probably in '89, not before. In the immediate post-war years, underground space was used for other purposes. And I have to mention here the underground life of this very neighborhood, Saint-Germain-des-Prés, and the clubs that proliferated after '45, where the so-called existentialist youth danced bebop and other imported dances. And the city planners of Paris resumed working on underground space. And here it's difficult to leave aside in thinking about the reflection on Paris city planning, the Plan Lafay, the plan proposed by municipal councillor Bernard Lafay in 1954. This plan was based, first of all, on the completion of the Boulevard Périphérique, of the Beltway in red, of the creation of new underground roads crossing Paris, the yellow one in particular, and the creation of a ring of underground roads and parkway and parkings under the very center of Paris in blue. So the Plan Lafay in plan and in section. You see here the idea of creating one of these gigantic parking lots, but related, connected to a network and not only operating alone under the Place Vendôme. Plan Lafay, 1954. And this is, of course, the origin of this project by Memon, the idea of using the sand bed to solve all the problems of Paris. At a time in which megastructural thinking was also involving underground space. This project by Memon has to be contextualized in a worldwide discussion in which we might find, for instance, the project by Paul Rudolph for the Lower Manhattan Expressway, crazy project by all accounts, in which we see with a different style, with a different system of forms, a different vocabulary, what were the early 20th century ideas. And it's not a coincidence if the only exhibition ever organized to this day on the work of Hénard is an exhibition that was done at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in '68, I think, in the context of this crazy project for the transformation of Manhattan. So by a sort of loop effect, these early experiments were returning to the surface. At the same time, the question, and this dialectics between underground and invisible and their overlappings could also be seen in many other projects of the 60s, and I will stop my analysis at the 60s. I've always been struck by this project by Archigram, one of the last projects by Archigram before they dissolved, and it's called, I forgot, yeah, it's called Rock Plug. You see at the bottom the explanation, Rock Plug and Lock Plug. It's the idea of appliances, of systems for the dissemination of energy, information, and various networks that are camouflaged as rocks or as logs. It's exactly camouflage, literally camouflage, using fake forms, hiding technology with pseudo-natural forms. After having really disseminated extremely conspicuous, extremely visually very complex machines over the ground, Archigram was suddenly discovering this other way of dealing. And in terms of underground space, I'm also interested, there are several other projects, but I think that this project by Gaetano Pesce, Italian architect and designer of '74, the Church of Solitude, I think it is called, is also a very amazing example of the endless, eternal return of these ideas into architectural discourse, at least until the 1970s. Thank you.
Is it ever a question of sealing a volume of air? In these projects, when in the underground projects, is it ever a question of sealing off a volume of air, of being protected from an atmosphere that's been from chemical warfare, for example? I'm curious. Yes, okay.
No, I mean, if we look at the wartime projects strictly, they were all considering that there were three types of dangers: explosive bombs, and here were shelters, thick shelters were meaningful, incendiary bombs, and chemical bombs. So the idea was you had three types of menaces, and that the underground, burying yourself underground was a way of responding to the three of them. Okay, so the idea of not only of the atmosphere becoming bad, but also of huge shocks being produced by explosive bombs. And if you look at the delightful little book published by Tecton, Planned ARP, Planned Air Raid Protection of 1939, you can buy it maybe for €40 on the internet with luck. You will see all the caricatures of Gordon Cullen, who would become, after the war, the inventor in England of the notion of townscape and a great illustrator in the pages of the Architectural Review. You will see all these examples of precisely what a shelter can respond to.
D'autres questions?
I know you just touched on shelters in the Cold War era, especially in the United States. Were collective underground shelters as popular in the United States as they were during the wartime in Europe?
Popular, I wouldn't say so. They were highly the idea of the atomic bomb was not very popular. But it is true that in all the American cities, if you look at Washington, I haven't seen yet a survey of underground Washington and its potential use, but all the cities were canvassed to find possible shelters for people working in offices or in factories. So beneath a sort of ridiculous aspect, it went from the ridiculous to the sublime, I must say, i.e. from the small family-sized shelter which were sold by all sorts of crooks to measures taken to bury the bureaucrats in Washington or the key producers. So there were indeed collective shelters that were almost never used and that were visible by very few indices. There are still, in New York, I found some of them, there are still signs indicating shelters, stairs leading to shelters. So many American cities were completely infiltrated with an underground network of places that were not always, I think, after 1961, not after the Berlin crisis and the Cuban Missile Crisis, they were no longer very well maintained. But you had a significant system also dealing with the massive urban population. And the Russians had the same. They were less careful and less obsessive because they minimized cynically the impact an atomic war would have had. But the Russians did the same thing.
Do I perhaps in French, no? Okay. Alors, je trouve qu'il y a quelque chose d'assez perturbant dans tout ce que tu nous as montré entre les projets du début du XXe siècle, la fin du XIXe siècle, à Paris par exemple, les projets souterrains, et après le passage en fait que ces projets souterrains sont des projets de protection contre la destruction. Voilà. Et alors, parallèlement, moi j'ai toujours pensé, enfin je me suis toujours imaginé que finalement tous les projets des années 30 sur Bersheimer, sur la rationalisation de la ville, d'une certaine manière, amenaient d'une certaine manière Dresde, enfin, amenaient la destruction de la ville. Et il y a peut-être, enfin, j'essaie de comprendre le passage, à quel moment finalement toutes ces théories qui sont des théories de rationalisation, de fonctionnement de la ville souterraine, hein, qui viennent du 19e siècle, Chicago et ainsi de suite, comment il y a cette espèce de glissement tout d'un coup pour être un système finalement contre la destruction. À quel moment ça se fait ce passage-là?
I don't think that the relationship is direct. I mean, it's both a parallel history and a history in which you find some crossings. So it's clear that the idea of getting rid of the old cities was very popular in the 1930s among architects, but also among civic leaders. Frank Lloyd Wright gave an interview to a British newspaper in 1939. He was lecturing in London, and he was asked about his opinion. Asked his opinion about the incoming war, and he said the best thing that could happen to Europe would be the total bombing out of its cities. The best thing. So there was a widespread consensus that existing cities were unhealthy, were too dense, and that the war in the end might bring a courageous solution to problems that the political classes, especially the political classes of the democracies, were unable to tackle. Then I don't think that the demolition of Dresden is related to the bombing of Dresden in April 45 was informed by strategies of city planning. It's clearly a strategic/political decision. There are, however, some other examples, and I want just to mention a very intriguing example. I've not been working on it. I've been working on it for a different project, for an exhibition I'm doing on the French-German relationship in the 19th and 20th century, an exhibition opening in Strasbourg in next March. And I've been interested by the events that took place in Marseille in 1943. Extremely interesting moment. Interesting is again inappropriate. The Wehrmacht, the German army, demolishes a large part of the old city, and pretending that they were only implementing the renovation, the renewal plan designed by Baudouin, Eugène Baudouin, who later after the war was accused of having inspired them. But things are very, very complex. The project of the Nazis is to get rid of a city that symbolically is considered as one of the most racially most diverse, i.e. most dangerous, most shameful places of Europe, with the entire world flocking into the city. And they do it without any military purposes, as a sort of act of racial terror, but in relationship with an existing project for the demolition of the area, which had been made by Baudouin, which was as brutal, but not leaving much else, but designed in a completely different context. Complex story.
Je n'ai pas vu en français ou en anglais ou en français la question, en anglais la réponse. J'ai pas vu d'image poétique, je sais pas, quelque chose qui fasse rêver. Et je pense à une très vieille tradition des cités souterraines en Turquie, Ihlara ou des choses comme ça. Et je pense aussi à des architectures comme Emilio Ambas. Ce jeu avec être sous terre, regarder le ciel, etc. Tu nous as montré pêche ou des exemples comme ça, mais très peu. Il n'y a pas eu, donc ma question, il n'y a pas une sorte de volet poétique, positif de tout ça?
if there is any poetic aspect to this story. Certainly I've told the scary story today. Technocratic or military. No, there's certainly another way of telling the story, and you've mentioned Ambas. One could mention Le Corbusier's plan for the underground basilica at the Saint-Baume, and his interest and the role Villa Adriana, partly buried spaces that Villa Adriana had for him. So there is another way of understanding the underground, and it begins probably with Piranesi. It's what I would call the Piranesi effect. Yeah, Eupheris is Piranesian. It's about chiaroscuro, about this manipulation of light. So, of course, I've not pretended. Maybe you will inspire me to write a complete history of a phenomenon. But I just have 12 books ahead of me, but maybe I can plan this one for 2035. But no, certainly there is another aspect which is more poetic. Here we're seeing when the question of the use, again, hiding, revealing, digging meets with modernization. And we know that the war is the most extreme type of modernization. We only need to read Walter Benjamin to be convinced of that if we are not. Une autre question là-haut?
C'est une question en forme un peu de spéculation. J'ai lu un article où on parle autour de cette question de la possibilité que l'Iran construise l'arme atomique, et on parlait de danger imminent qu'il puisse éventuellement s'installer dans un endroit souterrain qui serait totalement indestructible. Est-ce que par exemple ce fantasme de l'endroit souterrain indestructible, il est aussi, comment dire, il prend place dans ces exemples que vous venez, très intéressants, que vous venez de mentionner?
Absolutely. When we see all the discussions and maneuvers today with Iran and the grottos they use, the underground factories that are deeper and deeper, it's part of the same story. I mean, they're just following the same line. They're doing it with Chinese or Russian experts. The Russians built, among the many secret factories they built and secret cities. This is another issue. It would be another topic, but maybe this is a lecture I could give another time. The secret cities in the Soviet Union, 75 total cities that were had no name, that were only a postal code. People used to say, "I live in a mailbox," because the only way of defining the place they were was the mail code, which was changing from time to time. So there were the idea of hiding cities, at least until the satellite recognition could be a sustainable one. And the Russians developed them, in particular in relationship with the production of rockets, atomic bomb and atomic fuel. And they're still existing today. They're not still mostly close to the foreigners. So this culture of secrecy developed throughout the Cold War, and the Iranians are only developing this with, of course, this continuous race between the deepest shelter and the most powerful bomb. We know today that the Americans have developed extremely powerful bombs that can penetrate through dozens of meters of concrete. And of course, that's from time to time the idea of using an atomic load to destroy one of these factories is mentioned. So the story is continuing in a more limited way, perhaps not as a worldwide drama, but at least as a localized one.
It's what you've talked about: destruction, protection, resistance, mainly in your fascinating lecture. And I was thinking, what do you think about the current frenzy of going underground for leisure purposes? I'm thinking in the Low Line project in New York, in juxtaposition with the High Line one, or the frenzy in Knightsbridge or Chelsea in London, where actually Russian oligarchs or multimillionaires are digging many, many floors under the houses with no need for protection or anything.
This is another kind of a totally different playful strategy, which is based on the idea of a completely controlled environment, and what could be more completely controlled than an environment with no light, without the perturbation of the surrounding city. With the idea of a buried bubble, which is also meant to be invisible or inaccessible. All these places are, the Low Line is probably a different one, but many of these places are by nature elitist, protected, and in the way belong to the same idea of it. There, we could probably use the concept of heterotopia proposed by Michel Foucault, other spaces that obey to a different order than the order of the surrounding city. When the surrounding city is under the bombs, creating a sort of orderly place of refuge is heterotopia, creating a place of leisure away from the crowd, where a sort of new bodily and spiritual balance can be found, is also building a heterotopia. So I think that the history and the present of city making and of design is made probably more through heterotopias of these various types than through utopias. My position is different. I'm no longer. It's no longer a contemporary project opposed to other projects. The city, it's a historical document. So, as a historian, I like historical documents, and I like to discuss them. Then, subscribing to their program is another story. It is possible that space could be used under the city, and that more infrastructure could be used. It's also difficult. We've just seen. I was in New York during the latest storm, and it's clear that the risks of building under the sea level has been evidentiated in many ways. So it's not clear that this project is a project related to a moment of extreme technological optimism, a moment we are no longer living it today. So let's leave it as a document.